Her husband won a 200 millimeters contract, and the very next day, he threw her out to marry his mistress. But as she stood in the rain clutching a single suitcase, he had no idea his fat, useless wife was the silent owner of the company that awarded him that 200 millimeters contract. And while he celebrated with his mistress, she was already setting in motion what she would do a few days later, a move so shocking it would strip him of power, dignity, and force him to beg for mercy. Who exactly was this wife he underestimated? How did she own the company behind his 200 millimeters contract? And what kind of revenge could turn a triumphant husband and his mistress into broken people overnight? The night before the 200 millimeters contract announcement, Daniel Whitmore had come home smiling wider than he had in years, loosening his tie as if the world itself had finally bowed to him. The television glowed in the background with financial news anchors praising his brilliance, his visionary leadership, his sudden rise from respected executive to untouchable industry star. Claire Whitmore stood in the kitchen, stirring soup she barely tasted, watching his reflection move confidently across the glass cabinet doors. He didn't look at her when he spoke about the contract, didn't notice the quiet way her hands trembled or the faint smile she forced onto her lips. She congratulated him anyway. She always did. For 10 years, Claire had learned to clap softly for Daniel's victories while shrinking herself to fit into the corners of his life. She had once been sharp-tongued, ambitious, brilliant in rooms full of men who underestimated her. But marriage to Daniel had slowly taught her another role. Be smaller, be quieter, be grateful. When she gained weight after years of stress, miscarriages, and late nights buried in work, she could never speak about Daniel's affection curdled into contempt. The word fat slipped into arguments, then into jokes, then into everyday conversation, until it became the only way he saw her. That same night, his phone buzzed on the counter. Once, twice. He smiled at the screen, a smile Claire hadn't received in years. When she asked who it was, he said, "Work," too quickly, then grabbed the phone and walked away. Claire watched him go, her chest tightening with a familiar ache. She already knew. She had known for months. The expensive cologne he wore only on business trips, the way he turned his body away when he took calls, the sudden cruelty as if guilt needed a target. The next morning, the news broke everywhere. Daniel Whitmore had secured the 200 millimeter contract that would redefine the construction tech sector. Investors called. Champagne arrived. Flowers flooded the house. By noon, Daniel stood taller, spoke louder, and looked at Claire like she was already part of his past. By evening, he ended their marriage. He didn't shout. He didn't cry. He simply told her to pack her things because this isn't working anymore. He said he had fallen in love with someone else, someone who understood him, someone who didn't let herself go. When Claire stared at him in silence, he added that the house was in his name, the lawyers were ready, and she should be grateful he was being generous enough to let her leave with dignity. Then the mistress arrived. Madeline Cross stepped into the doorway like she belonged there, tall, elegant, dressed in white as if rehearsing for a wedding. She looked Claire up and down with poorly hidden satisfaction, her lips curving in a smile that wasn't kind. Daniel wrapped an arm around Madeline's waist and told Claire she had 5 minutes. Claire didn't scream, she didn't beg. She walked upstairs, packed a single suitcase, and paused only once at the locked drawer Daniel had never bothered to open. Inside was a slim phone, a different name, a different life. She left it behind on purpose. When she stepped outside, rain soaked her hair and clung to her clothes. Daniel shut the door behind her without looking back. From inside, laughter rose. His laughter, her laughter, celebrating the 200 millimeter contract, the new life, the future they believed was theirs. Claire stood on the curb, rain mixing with tears she refused to wipe away. A passing car splashed water onto her shoes, but she didn't flinch. Her reflection stared back at her from a darkened window. Heavier than she used to be, yes, but her eyes were clear, sharp, awake. The humiliation burned, but beneath it, something else stirred. Calculation, resolve, memory. Because Daniel didn't know the truth. He didn't know that Claire wasn't just a discarded wife. He didn't know that the anonymous holding firm behind the company that awarded him the 200-millimeter contract answered to her alone. He didn't know that every clause, every deadline, every penalty was something she had personally approved. And he certainly didn't know that throwing her out had unlocked something she had been holding back for years. As Claire stepped into a waiting cab she had ordered long before the argument began, her phone buzzed in her hand. A single message from her legal counsel flashed on the screen. "All documents are ready. Your move." She leaned back, closed her eyes, and let the rain wash away the last of her hesitation. Daniel and his mistress were celebrating a 200-millimeter contract they believed had made them untouchable. They had no idea the owner had just been betrayed. Claire didn't go to a friend's house that night. She didn't curl up in shame or replay Daniel's words until they broke her. The cab dropped her at a quiet glass and steel building overlooking the river, a place Daniel had passed 100 times without ever knowing it mattered to her. The doorman greeted her by name and opened the door without surprise. Inside, warmth, light, and silence wrapped around her like armor. She showered, changed into clean clothes, and stood before the mirror. The woman looking back at her was the same one Daniel had mocked. Fuller, older, softer around the edges. But beneath that surface lived the mind that had built empires quietly, while men like him took bows on stage. Claire dried her hair slowly, deliberately, as if every motion was a declaration. She was done shrinking. Her phone lit up again, not with apologies, not with doubt, with reports. The 200-millimeter contract Daniel had bragged about was phase one of a larger acquisition strategy Claire had designed years earlier under a different name. She had structured it so that performance milestones triggered funding releases. Miss 1 and penalties stacked. Miss 2 and ownership shifted. It was airtight, legal, invisible to anyone who thought too highly of themselves to read footnotes. Flashbacks came uninvited as she scrolled. Late nights when Daniel had laughed at her boring spreadsheets. The time he told her she didn't need to work so hard anymore because his career would take care of them. The day she'd overheard him on the phone calling her dead weight. Each memory sharpened her focus, not softened it. Across town, Daniel and Madeline toasted champagne on the balcony of a luxury hotel. Madeline wore a silk robe and his grin, drunk on victory and validation. She asked if he felt bad about Claire. He shrugged and said Claire would be fine, maybe even grateful in time. He joked about finally being free, about how winning the 200-millimeter contract proved he had been right all along. The next morning, Claire arrived at her office early. The conference room filled quietly with people who didn't underestimate her. Executives, lawyers, auditors. No one commented on her appearance. They listened. She spoke calmly, clearly, outlining a timeline that would look like bad luck to anyone on the outside. First, a compliance review, routine, then a request for documentation. Daniel's company had rushed through under pressure, then silence, just long enough for investors to grow uneasy. By day 3, Daniel noticed the shift. Calls weren't returned. Meetings were postponed. The first tranche of funding didn't arrive. He blamed bureaucracy, then rivals, then his legal team. Madeline reassured him, told him powerful men always faced jealousy. She told him Claire was probably crying somewhere, realizing what she'd lost. On day 4, Claire authorized the audit. It hit Daniel's company like a quiet storm. No headlines yet, just emails, notices, polite questions that carried weight. His lawyers' faces tightened. His partners grew cautious. The 200-millimeter contract, once his crown jewel, began to feel heavy, conditional, alive in a way he didn't control. Claire watched the reports come in without expression. She remembered the night Daniel had told her to leave with 5 minutes' notice. She remembered the rain, the laughter behind the door, She didn't rush. Revenge, she knew, wasn't about speed. It was about precision. Madeline started to sense it first. Daniel grew irritable, distracted, snapping over small things. He canceled dinners, took calls in the bathroom. She overheard him arguing with his CFO at 2 a.m., his voice tight with fear. She asked if everything was okay. He told her not to worry, but worry crept in anyway. On day 6, Claire approved the final step, a clause Daniel had never noticed activated automatically when his company failed to meet a reporting requirement. Ownership didn't vanish. It shifted, quietly, legally, completely. Daniel was in a boardroom when his lawyer slid the document across the table. His smile faded as he read. His hands shook. He asked who the majority stakeholder was. Who had the authority to do this? Who had set the trap? The name at the bottom of the page didn't register at first. Then it did. Claire Whitmore. The room went silent. Daniel laughed once, sharp and disbelieving, and said it had to be a mistake. His lawyer didn't laugh back. Across the city, Claire stood at her window, watching the river move steadily forward, her phone buzzing non-stop with calls she chose not to answer. The man who had thrown her out to marry his mistress had just realized the company behind his 200 million contract belonged to the wife he'd discarded. And this was only the beginning. Daniel didn't go home that night. He sat alone in his office long after the city lights blurred into a smear of gold and gray beyond the glass, rereading the documents as if the words might rearrange themselves out of pity. They didn't. Every page carried the same truth. The 200 million contract that had made him untouchable now belonged to Claire, not symbolically, not indirectly, completely. He replayed the last months in his head with a sickening clarity, her silence, her patience, the way she never argued when he dismissed her opinions, the way she had watched him celebrate, eyes unreadable. It hadn't been weakness, it had been restraint. His phone rang. Madeline. He didn't answer. Across town, Claire sat in a private dining room with her legal team, untouched food cooling in front of her. They spoke in measured tones about next steps, governance changes, executive reviews, public disclosures. Claire listened, nodding occasionally, her mind drifting not to numbers but to faces. Daniel's face when he called her useless. Madeline's smile in her doorway. The rain. She approved everything. The next morning, the news broke, not with drama, but with precision. Headlines spoke of unexpected restructuring, of major shareholder intervention, of leadership uncertainty. Daniel's name appeared less and less. Analysts speculated, investors panicked, phones rang off the hook. Daniel finally went home to the penthouse he now shared with Madeline. She met him at the door, anxiety etched into her perfect features. She had seen the news. She demanded answers. He snapped at her, told her to stop reading gossip, but when she asked if Claire had something to do with it, his silence said everything. Madeline's confidence cracked. She began to understand that she hadn't married a king. She had married a man standing on someone else's throne. Claire scheduled the meeting herself. Neutral location, glass walls, morning light. Daniel arrived early, thinner than she remembered, his suit suddenly ill-fitting. When she walked in, he stood without thinking, habit overpowering pride. For a moment, neither spoke. She looked the same, different, calmer, in control. He tried to smile. It failed. She spoke first, her voice steady. She thanked him for freeing her, for underestimating her, for showing her exactly who he was when he thought he had won. She explained the contract, the clauses, the structure he had ignored, because he believed success came from confidence alone. He interrupted, apologized too quickly, too loudly. He said he'd made a mistake. He blamed pressure, temptation, ego. He said Madeline meant nothing now. He said he still loved her. Claire listened without expression. Then she slid a folder across the table. Inside were termination papers, not for revenge, for closure. His position dissolved, his shares reassigned, his reputation, once sterling, now permanently questioned. He would leave with a settlement generous enough to survive, small enough to remind him every day of what he'd lost. He begged, not subtly, not with dignity. He begged like a man watching his future collapse in slow motion. He promised change. He promised loyalty. He promised anything. Claire stood. She told him mercy wasn't something you asked for after cruelty. It was something you protected before betrayal. She wished him luck. She meant it in the way one means luck for strangers. When she left, Daniel stayed seated, staring at the glass as if it might shatter and end the moment. Madeline left him a week later. The lifestyle vanished faster than it had appeared. The invitations stopped. The friends faded. The world that had once applauded him now spoke his name as a cautionary tale. Months later, Claire stood on a stage accepting an industry award. Cameras flashed. Applause rose. She spoke briefly, not about revenge, but about resilience, about the danger of mistaking silence for weakness. Somewhere in the crowd, Daniel watched, unseen. He didn't clap. He didn't need to. She had already won. Daniel tried to rebuild quietly. He moved into a smaller apartment across town, far from the glass towers and champagne balconies that had once defined his life. The mirrors there were unforgiving. Every morning they showed him a man who had mistaken control for intelligence and arrogance for strength. The calls he made went unanswered. The favors he asked were politely declined. People didn't insult him. They simply forgot him, and that was worse. Claire, meanwhile, did not rush to enjoy her victory. She worked. She arrived early, left late, and rebuilt the company openly now, no longer hidden behind shell structures or quiet signatures. Employees noticed the difference immediately. There was order where there had been chaos, transparency where there had been ego. The same traits Daniel had mocked at home were the ones stabilizing a 200-meter operation under public scrutiny. Flashbacks came to her in strange moments, while reviewing budgets, while walking past framed photos of leadership teams that once excluded her. She remembered Daniel standing in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie, asking her if he looked powerful. She remembered lying awake beside him, listening to him plan a future that no longer included her. Even before he said it out loud, she didn't miss him. The final blow came quietly, like everything else she had done. An independent review, one she had authorized weeks earlier, released its findings. Daniel hadn't committed crimes, but his leadership failures were documented in careful, unflinching language. Negligence, misrepresentation, breach of fiduciary duty, the kind of words that follow a man longer than handcuffs ever could. Investors withdrew permanently. Boards rescinded offers. His name became weight. Madeline tried to contact Claire once. A carefully worded email, half apology, half justification. Claire didn't respond. Some battles didn't deserve acknowledgement. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Claire returned to the street where Daniel had thrown her out. She stood across from the house, now for sale, a sign planted where her suitcase had once rested in the rain. She didn't feel triumph. She felt release. Daniel saw her from his car. He pulled over without thinking, stepping out with a desperation that hadn't left him since the meeting. He looked older, smaller. He asked if they could talk, just once more. He said he had learned his lesson. He said he understood now. Claire listened. Then she told him the truth he had never been ready to hear. She told him she had never been too much. She had never been worthless. She had never been the problem. The only thing she had been guilty of was loving someone who needed her to be less so he could feel like more. Daniel's shoulders slumped. There was nothing left to say. She walked away without looking back. That night, Claire hosted a small dinner with people who had believed in her long before the world did. Laughter filled the room. Not loud, not performative. Real. When she caught her reflection in the window, she barely recognized the woman smiling back. Not because she was thinner or richer or more powerful, but because she was free. The story didn't end with Daniel ruined and Claire triumphant. It ended with balance restored. Months later, a young woman stopped Claire after a conference, eyes shining, voice shaking. She said she had been told to stay quiet, to be grateful, to accept being diminished. She asked how Claire had found the courage to fight back. Claire smiled gently and said, "I didn't fight back, I stepped forward." Somewhere in the city, Daniel read about her success in passing. He closed the article without bitterness, only regret. The $200 million contract that had destroyed his arrogance had built her legacy, and the woman he once threw out in the rain had become the standard by which power was measured, not by cruelty, not by noise, but by the calm certainty of someone who knows exactly who she is and what she's worth. 5 years later, the story people told about the $200 million contract had changed. In business schools, it was no longer framed as a tale of sudden success or spectacular failure, but as a quiet lesson in ownership, foresight, and the cost of underestimating the wrong person. Claire Whitmore's name appeared in case studies, her decisions dissected not for drama, but for discipline. She rarely commented on the past. When asked, she simply said the company had needed stability, and she had provided it. Her life settled into something solid and unglamorous in the best way. Mornings began with calm, evenings ended without fear. She invested in mentorship programs for women who had been told to make themselves smaller to survive. She never spoke about revenge, but everyone understood the message. Power didn't need permission. Daniel Whitmore became a footnote. He worked in consulting now, far from the spotlight, offering advice he once ignored. Sometimes when he passed reflective glass, he remembered the woman he had thrown out into the rain and wondered how different everything might have been if he had listened. Regret stayed with him, not sharp enough to wound, but heavy enough to follow. As for Madeline, she reinvented herself in another city, another circle, chasing another version of admiration. She avoided stories that mentioned Claire Whitmore. Some names carried lessons people preferred not to learn. On a quiet evening, Claire stood on her balcony overlooking the river, the same steady current she had watched the night her life split in two. She held a cup of tea, the air cool against her skin, her reflection calm and unafraid. She hadn't won because she was cruel. She had won because she was prepared, and long after the contract expired and the headlines faded, that truth remained, silent, unshakable, and entirely hers. 10 years after the night she was thrown out into the rain, Claire Whitmore walked through an auditorium filled with quiet anticipation. The stage lights were warm, the applause restrained but sincere, the kind reserved for people whose influence runs deeper than fame. She was there to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award, not for a single deal, not even for the $200 million contract that once defined her story, but for a decade of steady leadership that had reshaped an entire sector. As she stood at the podium, Claire paused, letting the room settle. She didn't speak about betrayal. She didn't mention revenge. She spoke about accountability, about how true power reveals itself when no one is watching. She spoke about the danger of mistaking loud confidence for competence, and about how often brilliance is overlooked simply because it doesn't demand attention. The audience leaned in. After the ceremony, a journalist asked her if she ever thought about the past, about the husband who had thrown her out, about the mistress, about the humiliation that had once trailed her name. Claire considered the question carefully. Then she answered with a soft smile. "I think about the lesson," she said, "not the people." That answer traveled farther than any headline ever had. Across the city, in a modest apartment lined with old books and outdated awards, Daniel watched a muted clip of her speech on his laptop. He recognized the calm authority in her voice, the same calm he had once mistaken for weakness. He closed the screen slowly, not in anger, but in acceptance. Some doors, he understood now, closed not as punishment but as consequence. Years passed. Claire's company expanded globally, not through aggressive takeovers but through partnerships built on trust. She stepped back from daily operations eventually, choosing instead to serve as chairwoman, guiding rather than commanding. In her personal life, she found joy without spectacle, friendships that felt safe, love that didn't require shrinking, laughter that didn't echo with fear. One spring afternoon, she received a letter, handwritten on simple stationery. It was from a young woman in her mentorship program who had just been promoted to CEO after years of being underestimated. The letter ended with a single line, "I didn't ask for mercy, I asked for my worth." Claire folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer with others like it. On the anniversary of the contract's signing, she returned once more to the river. The city had changed, new buildings, new faces, but the water flowed the same, indifferent to drama, faithful to direction. She thought of the night she had sat in a cab, soaked and silent, holding a phone that carried her future. She realized then that the story people loved to tell, the revenge, the fall, the begging, had never really been the point. The point was this: a woman was discarded, underestimated, and humiliated, and she did not ask the world to save her. She built a better one instead. And somewhere, long after the applause faded, long after the names lost their sting, that quiet truth endured, stronger than revenge, deeper than triumph, and entirely her own.